Hello and welcome to another Tech Leaders Launchpad live stream. This is where I get the people that I learn from to share their wisdom with you. I'm Andrew Murphy. If you've never seen me before, I teach technology leadership skills. I run a business called Tech Leaders Launchpad. And part of what I do is this series of live streams where I try and highlight the people that have been my coaches, my mentors, the people that I've spent a lot of time learning from over the years and give you the benefit of their experience. When I started being a leader 15 years ago, there wasn't a lot of resources out there, and I had to learn things the hard way. My mission now is to make sure you don't have to, and you don't have to spend 15 years becoming a better leader. There's a great number of resources out there already, but there can always be more and better ones. So today I've got with me James. James is a very experienced person in the startup space, spent a lot of time in leadership, and he also built a training course for Tech Leaders Launchpad. And that's kind of the basis of what we're going to spend a lot of our time discussing today is what he built that training course on. One of the things I do when I bring new trainers onto Tech Leaders Launchpad is I ask them the question, what's the one thing that you wished every single engineering manager knew? And straight away, James was talking about micromanagement. So it's obviously strong passion. James, where does this live stream find you? Where are you physically in the world right now? Oh, you're muted, James.
Of course. Hello, everyone. I'm physically in San Francisco, California.
Amazing. That's one of the great things about the world we find ourselves in 2025 is we can do this. 15 years ago, there's no way you and I will be having this conversation. 10 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. But definitely. Yeah, definitely. It's an amazing progress that we can have this. So tell the audience a little bit about you, a little bit about your background and kind of, what's led up to the career you've had today.
Yeah, I would say, I was just talking with a mentee yesterday and he put it better than I could have myself. He was like, I looked at your LinkedIn and it seems like your career has really been defined in helping improve systems and processes. And I looked at that and I was like, by golly, you're right. And I really like that introduction. So that is what I should put somewhere. I started my career as a management consultant. So that work is a lot about going into large companies and helping them improve their systems and processes. Following that, I started my own business. And then on track with starting my own business, I also did a lot of consulting and advisory work for other tech startups. Of course, being in San Francisco, that's a key industry here. And a lot of that work has been about just going in, finding out where there are opportunities to improve efficiency, to improve automation, to improve what you would call like standards of excellence. That has been something that's really important to me. I do say this, so I'm allowed to say this about myself, but I call myself an efficiency slut. Really, it's just like I really care about not doing things again and doing things in a silly, redundant way. And that's really defined a lot of my career and a lot of what I'm passionate about, especially building this course, Andrew, what you were saying, right? Like the definition of inefficiency would be learning your lessons repeatedly without any external guidance and without any guidelines or road signs to help you along the way. And that's why I was really passionate about building this out.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I think, as engineers, we often forget that the things we learn about our software, we can apply in multiple different ways. Dry as a concept, don't repeat yourself. That's all about, turning the software system into something that is doesn't have waste in it, doesn't have, reuse in it. And these techniques as engineers, we should be applying to other parts of our lives.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. At a tech startup that I was working at, I actually talked about dry so much that when I left, they told me that other people started talking about dry, but in like a non-engineering context, right? Because we're very familiar with it in engineering context, but you can reuse so many of these concepts elsewhere, whether it's in your business or in your personal life. So yeah, I'm all for translations. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. If you're watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitch, please use the chatty function there. I've got, maybe a few questions for James. James and I, when we talk, tend to spend a lot of time chatting, but we'll try and come back to your questions and comments in the chat. So please feel free to post any of those in there. If you have to drop off the live stream early, don't worry. Whatever platform you're watching this on, it gets recorded. You can come back to it later and rewatch it. And yeah, let's get into this then. So I started this off by talking about how the training course you built for Tech Leaders Launchpad was on micromanagement, and that came from this idea of me asking you the question of what's the one thing you wished engineering managers knew or got better at that. So tell me why you think micromanagement is such a big problem for you to spend days of your time building a training course and educating people on.
Yeah. It's broader than engineering management. It's really all management, people managers everywhere. I'm really passionate about this course because I was a horrible micromanager. And the first, gosh, I always joke about this. I don't know the exact number, but I always say the first dozen direct reports I had, they must still think I'm an asshole and curse my name to this day because I was terrible, and it wasn't until I had a reckoning with myself because so many people had quit on me that I was like, maybe it's me, maybe it's me, I'm the problem. And that required a lot of introspection. And as part of that introspection, I did a lot of external research on just how to be a better manager in general. I looked at studies and I learned these crazy statistics. And I highlighted this in these course, but over 2/3 of people say that they have been micromanaged. And about that same percentage of people say they've thought about quitting because of it. And then just under 1/3 of people have actually quit because of having a micromanager. If you think about the impact of a manager on your life, just the ones that are really good and the ones that have been really bad, and think about how different your momentum at work and your career trajectory has felt in those moments, you realize that, gosh, like everything they say about the blast radius of a manager, it's very true. It's very large. And especially for you as someone who's feeling in that moment, it's very sharp. It's very poignant. And when I sat with myself and realized that, I was like, gosh, now I really want to share this with people. One of the things that is true today in 2025 is, AI and robotics still are not doing all of our jobs yet, which means that unless your goal is to be a sole proprietor and to operate at the level of, I'm an independent artisan doing my own thing, unless that's your goal, which is fine. If you're building any kind of product, try scale any kind of company, you have to deal with people. People operations are going to be the most important thing, the biggest bottleneck for you at some point. And these skills are so important to learn because I think, especially in my work right now, I do a lot of advising for founders. For founders especially, I think there's a big tendency to micromanage. And so I'm really passionate about, gosh, how do I make it so that other people don't do this and don't make these same mistakes?
Yeah, and it's such an easy mistake to make because often, especially in knowledge work, we become a leader because we're good at doing the knowledge work. So my first job as a software leader, I got not because I was any good at leadership. I got because I was a good engineer and I was at the right place at the right time. And so, surely if I got promoted to leadership, that meant that my way of doing things, my knowledge, my decisions were better than the people I was leading. That was the thought process that I had that kind of led me down this pathway in the beginning of my career of micromanagement. How do you begin to kind of overcome that mindset and kind of change the way you think about that problem?
It's interesting. I think everyone's journey to finding this insight for themselves will be a little bit different. Some companies, unfortunately, I don't think the majority of companies, but I think some companies do a really good job of training new leaders and new managers and telling them that, hey, people management is a very different job. It's a very, very different job than being a technically excellent engineer or being an architect or being an expert in whatever subject matter domain that you had, right? People management is all about dealing with the messiness of communication, of emotions, and all of that is actually going to take up more of your time and mental energy than actually thinking about the work. For me, how I got to that insight really was time. It was spending a lot more time in the workforce and shedding that ego a little bit because especially when you're in San Francisco and Silicon Valley in the heart of, tech land in the universe, I think there very much is a sense of, try to save the world mentality and exporting things that will benefit mankind. But I think at some point along my journey, I very much was like, the world operated fine before I was born and before I got a job, and the world will continue to operate fine when I'm dead. And it was there is an impact that I want to have, but it was learning to be realistic about that impact and recognizing that things will continue. Other people have their own ways of doing things, and there isn't a right way of doing it. That was really insightful for me. I will say there was a book that really inspired me in this process. Daniel Quinn is an author that I really like. He has a series of books actually, but they're very much around the same topic. One of the ones I like to start people with is called The Story of B, just the letter B. And that really inspired me and unlocked this idea that there's not one right way of doing things. And a lot of times when we approach management or leadership with like, hey, everyone, it's time to do it my way. Here's my template. We're kind of presuming that our way of doing things is the best way, which may be the case, but also may not be the case.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, Jason, thank you for this comment. This is a great comment. That inside of maybe it's me is such a great lesson in its own. The inside of figuring out maybe you're causing the negative pattern you see is emotionally challenging. This is something that took me a long time to realize as a new leader was, I thought it was everybody else's problem but my own. And I had to have a reality check by my then boss at the time, who brought me into a meeting room and basically pointed out to me all the mistakes I was making. And it took that kind of shoving my face in it effectively for me to realize that. Now, in my mid-20s, I was incredibly arrogant. And so that was probably the right choice at that time, was to be that kind of assertive with me. But for other people, maybe that's not the right approach. Like if you were leading somebody who was, you were seeing these behaviors of micromanagement, how would you go about starting that conversation with them? Maybe they're reporting into you, or maybe they're a peer. How would you start that conversation?
Yeah, you're very right that it really depends on the context in which I'm working with them, whether or not they're a peer or they're someone that's reporting into me. I would say if it's someone that's reporting into me, there's a little bit more leeway that I have, because at the end of the day, if there's someone reporting into me, I'm very invested in professional development if the other person wants to grow, right? So if this is a relationship with someone that I have where we've expressed to each other, hey, we want to mutually help each other grow. Can we flag things? Can we flag development milestones? That gives me the window to bring up things like that. And thanks to my own background in the space and working with founders, I have a list of things that we can talk about where I'm monitoring for these types of behaviors and whatnot. If they're a peer, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more challenging. There could be more complicated interpersonal dynamics involved. So then I would really have to think about to what is the existing relationship that we have. Is it a friend of mine? Is it a personal friend versus a work friend? Is this someone that I might work with in the future because they might not take feedback so well, and that might impinge on a future relationship? So it gets to be a little bit more complicated. I think an overall guideline that I would start with for either of these conversations is just to level set and start with an expression of sincerity and say that, hey, I want to offer some feedback, some things that I have noticed based on some patterns I've seen in myself, which may not be true for you, the other person, right? But starting from that, so they don't, because I think a lot of times receiving feedback is still one of the hardest things for humans. and we don't want to feel attacked. And I want to level set and make sure that people understand that, hey, this is feedback that I want to share with you. You don't have to accept it, first off. So I always ask that permission. But if you do accept it, know that I'm coming at you with good intentions here.
Yeah, that's one of the keys of great feedback is there has to be the assumption of positive intent from the other side, or you just pushing that boulder uphill. One of the things I said in that question was, if you noticed the behaviors of micromanagement, one of the things you talk about in the course are, you call them the 4 behaviors. Do you want to just give us a little bit of a rundown of what those behaviors are and kind of, why those behaviors have negative consequences associated with them?
Yeah. So I called these 4 behaviors. And by the way, Andrew, you don't know this, but I had to think of cute little names because I think they, it's easy to remember cute names, right? So I call them the Badinsky, the eager beaver, the backseat driver, and the impatient chaser. These are the 4 types of behaviors. When I started classifying what I was doing, what I've had other people do to me, because I've been a micromanager at the same time that I was being micromanaged. So it's very much a self-fulfilling prophecy there and perpetuating cycle. And I want to emphasize these 4 categories of behaviors, it's not MECE, it's not mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. It's more, they're very related. So I think of them less as like 4 discrete balls and more like 4 blobs kind of mashed together. And maybe some people are spiking a little bit more on doing chasing and other people are spiking a little bit more on butting in. These are all things that I think it's a little bit easier to notice in conversations, in communications, whether it's over email, whether it's over Slack. With founders that I work with on a one-on-one basis, I do have an offer where I'm like, you can invite me into your Slack and I will be a quiet observer and just look at the cadence of your communications, what you're asking for. I think one of the biggest challenges and what leads to a lot of these behaviors is that we as managers can often forget about the impact that we have. We forget about that blast radius. And one of the reasons I think we forget about that blast radius is because we forget there is fundamentally always going to be a power dynamic by definition. When you ask for something of someone that is your direct report, it feels different than asking it of someone who is your peer or asking it of your manager, for example, right? And it's very easy to forget because I think we get to a point where we're like, gosh, we're all very busy, at work, and we're all trying to work on the same thing. Can you just give me this, right? But it's not necessarily taken the same way, and so that's why those behaviors can have negative impacts. And part of evaluating those behaviors is also recognizing that each of your direct reports is their own individual and mapping to their needs. Some people are going to be more sensitive. They're going to be more anxious, right, than other people. And maybe the first group is the person that will need you to be a little bit more aware when you're asking them to do something, that's like above and beyond the normal cadence of work. Versus someone else would be like, okay, sure, just give it to me. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. Go through those 4 behaviors and just give us 2-sentence, 3-sentence, 4-sentence on what you would see if somebody was exhibiting those behaviors, or ideally what you might notice in yourself if you were kind of exhibiting those behaviors.
Yeah. So Badinsky, I don't know if this is true everywhere in the English speaking world, but at least here in the US, right? A Badinsky is like, I'm noticing other people talking about something and I just can't help myself by interjecting and being like, hey, I heard you talking about this new product. That's really cool. I think this should be the roadmap for it. And I have all these different ideas. And oh, you know what? Can I come to these meetings, by the way? And I think I have a lot of great ideas. And that would be the Badinsky for me. The eager beaver, it's again a cute little name that I don't know if this resonates everywhere in the English speaking world. An eager beaver for me is someone that is it's not their project, but they're like, so imagine you're taking the lead on building a new feature. But I'm the one that's like, hey, have you done it yet? Hey, have you done it yet? Can we get started? Or like, I found this report for you. It's almost taking that initiative off of your plate a little bit when it should be on your plate. That's very similar to the impatient chaser, by the way. The impatient chaser for me is like, this is the person in the child in the car that's like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? The difference here is that the impatient chaser knows that it's your job. So they're not saying that it's their job at all. But even though they know it's your job, they just can't help but being like, hey, da da da, have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? Even if, for example, you have, as an autonomous person in your own team, you said, to the other person, hey, I would like to, get this done by Friday, right? And then on Wednesday, I'm like, hey, are we tracking for Friday? And then on Thursday, I'm like, hey, Friday's tomorrow. Are we tracking for Friday? And not giving you the space to, watch your own timeline. And the last one, the backseat driver, is just the one that is constantly trying to course correct you. So you're doing something and they're like, hey, actually, I don't think we should do it that way. Can we do it a different way? For a lot of different things. One of the things I really want to emphasize as well, and I've been very careful to not say, necessarily a manager, because micromanagement is a behavior that doesn't have to come from a manager. It can come from someone in your team. It can come from a peer. It can come from a friend. It can come from a romantic partner. So many aspects of what we deal with in our work lives, in our work relationships, really map very cleanly to what we deal with in our personal lives. I mean, before this, we were just talking about co-founder dating as an analogy to romantic dating, because you have to check off those same milestones, right? The same thing applies to management and micromanagement. And so, as if I'm managing a team of multiple people, I will also watch out for those types of behaviors between the team members themselves.
Yeah. Those 4 categories, as you were going through them, what I was thinking about, well, first of all, I was thinking about all the times I exhibited those behaviors myself. Secondly, I was thinking about, there's each of these behaviors is on a spectrum. If we take, for example, the eager beaver or the chaser, that's this end of the spectrum. If we roll the spectrum all the way back to the other side, that can be a problem as well. I went through this transition early on in my career. I was very much a tell somebody what to do and how to do it and handhold them the entire way. This was a mistake that I hugely made. My second leadership job, I built the entire software system from scratch, and then we hired a bunch of engineers to come in and kind of scale, because I couldn't scale. Because I built the whole system from scratch, I knew every line of code intimately, and every time a change came through, I knew exactly in my head, okay, well, you go to this file and change this bit, and this file and change this bit. Like, I could picture the entire map of changes in my head. And so what I would do when I would delegate a piece of work is I would delegate exactly the steps and the files that needed to be changed. This gave me, at the time, I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was, telling people, giving them the benefit of my experience. What actually ended up happening over time, unknowingly to me, was I became the nexus of all information and the nexus of all decision making. And it got to the point where, as my team scaled, so, for one direct report, 2 direct reports, that kind of worked. But, when I was up at 5 or 6 direct reports, it got to the point where I couldn't even have lunch. I was so busy directing the intricacies of what my entire team were doing that I couldn't even take a break for lunch. And it got to a point with that where one of my team, seeing this as my problem, made me a little paper hat. And on the paper hat, it said, "Andrew is on lunch, go away." And I used to wear this paper hat during my lunch break so that I could have 30, 45 minutes to myself to just eat my lunch and unwind. And, at 25 years old, that was a perfectly appropriate solution to that problem. Looking back on that with a decade and a half experience, I see that was solving the entirely different problem. But I tell that story because the way I responded and course corrected from that was to swing entirely the opposite way. And my next job after that, I didn't do any of that at all, and I didn't chase people.
Yeah.
And the feedback that I got from my next boss was, you're being too lax on people. You're not chasing them,
Yeah.
like, that.
Yeah.
So both ends of the spectrum are, suboptimal, let's say. How do you find within that spectrum what the right kind of balance is for you in your
Yeah.
job?
Yeah, thank you. I love that story you share. It's a perfect example of key man risk or key person risk, where like you've become that central person. I also think it's a cool, this, I know you don't mean it as like a humble brag, but that is a cool evidence of your own memory, because I literally build things and it's, maybe it's been like a month or something, right? And someone's like, "Oh, where in the code is that?" I'm like, "I don't know. I forgot." I feel like I build and I don't remember things very easily. So, maybe not great for me. The key thing, and this is what I did really badly as well, is to remember that management is a one-to-one relationship. So I will agree with you that generally speaking, any end, as a general rule of thumb, the ends of the spectrum are never great. You always want to be somewhere in the middle. But when it comes to management, where you want to be in the middle depends on the person that you're managing. This is what I did really badly. So I'll give you an example for me. At some point in my career, and this is a rumor, so this is an unsubstantiated rumor to this day. At some point early on in my career, someone told me that they had heard from someone else that I was the best manager they'd ever had. And I was like, wow. And so I took that same approach to management that I've been doing in that moment, and I applied it to everybody else. And that's one of the reasons so many people are going, probably have this image in their heads that I'm a terrible manager, because that one style did not work for a bunch of other people. One of the biggest factors that will determine this, because it correlates with so many other things like skill set, is just the seniority of that person. But for me, it's all about having a first conversation with that person and trying to really understand what their needs are, where they are in that spectrum. There's like a framework that I liked that I learned in my early consulting days. I'm not sure if this framework has become problematic in any way, but it's like the confidence versus competence framework. And the idea is that if you follow the life cycle of someone from their first job out of college to, as they progress, right? They start out with really high confidence, but actually pretty low competence, right? Like you're like, I'm a hotshot person. I just graduated. Look at me. I'm great. But I don't actually know how to do things very well. And so rapidly, their confidence kind of deflates because their first couple of reviews aren't that great, right? And so then they get to a point where they're like still low competent, but they're also low confident. And so then your job as a manager is to really build them up to a point where, okay, their competence has increased over time as a natural function of their growth, but they're still low confident. And at that point, you're trying to build them to the final part, the top right quadrant, which is they're highly confident and they're highly competent. So how you as the manager need to show up for that person is very different along that entire spectrum. Um, I'll give you another example, which is this is from me being managed by someone. I remember I gave feedback to a manager once that I was like, I have never felt this micromanaged in my life. And to their credit, they sat with that and they're like, okay, let me reflect on this and get back to you. And the time they got back to me, they said, okay, I looked at my other feedback that I gotten from other people, and this seems like it to be like a you thing, And I remember being very disappointed in that response, because that response would have been the same response that I would have given before I made the realization that management is a one-to-one relationship. And the best way to think about this, again, is dating. Imagine if your current partner said to you, hey, I don't like the way you do that. And your response was, oh, well, all of my other exes were fine with it. That would be unacceptable, right? But that's exactly what was happening. And what often happens is that we're like, oh, on average, I'm fine. No one else has made this a problem. And we forget that, hey, by you as my direct report bring this to me as a problem, this is now a problem. And whether or not this is a problem in my other relationships, it's a problem in my relationship with you. And therefore, if I want to continue building this relationship with you, it is something that's important for me to work on.
one of the things we tend to focus a lot on in these live streams and, in Tech Leaders Launchpad in general, are these skills of working with other people, these kind of social skills, the relationship management skills. But I think it's important at this point to focus on something that's inherent in one of the things you're saying in a lot of this, which is the self-awareness that comes from this, and the introspection. And often I teach a lot about emotional intelligence, and when you talk about emotional intelligence, people go, okay, I want to be socially aware and I want to manage relationships, but I don't care about being self-aware and managing myself. I'm like, no, like you're missing the entire point. It's really, really hard to be really socially aware and manage your relationships well if you're not incredibly self-aware and manage yourself well. Like a lot of these external skills that we think of as managing other people start from managing ourselves. It's such an important part of leadership.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. In the course, I have a whole section on identifying what your triggers are, with examples on what might trigger you to feel the need to micromanage and how to minimize some of those triggers. And then I have a series of logic tree frameworks. I don't know if you've heard, there's a saying that I am not recalling right now, but I will send it to you and you can disseminate it in some fashion. But when, as humans, right, like when something happens, whether or not it's a positive trigger or a negative trigger, we respond in a certain way. And unfortunately, the way we've evolved is that response often can be a little compulsive and devoid of like actual conscious meaning. So one of the goals of my logic tree frameworks is to increase the space between when something happens and when you respond to it. Because in that space, you can better choose how you want to respond, and if that response is actually valid or if it was a compulsion in some way. Because I remember I had a lot of compulsions that were very highly negative, going back to those 4 categories of behaviors. I remember there was a specific person that I was working with, and they were just, honestly, they worked a little bit slower. And I remember once I was working side by side with them and I couldn't help myself. I literally blurted out, because they've been working on the same document for such a long time. The words just fell out of my mouth before I had any chance to stop them. I was like, "Are you still working on that?" And that was horrible, because in that moment, I didn't even necessarily mean it in like a negative way. But when you're a manager and you're saying this to a direct report, like, oh my gosh, of course, there's a high likelihood that they're going to take it in a very negative way, right? And that was just a terrible instinct of mine. And so one of my hacks for myself is I learned that, at least with that person, I started not working in the same space with them so that I wouldn't have that trigger. And that was one of the ways that I could minimize that trigger with regards to that relationship.
That's one of the keys of self-management, is like the time we need self-management the most is when we're the most emotionally challenged by something, or the most triggered by something. And that's the time when we're the least logical. And so, one of the keys of self-management is to build these systems before we get in that state, to enable us to not have to engage our logical mind and try and think through the solution in the moment. And we just apply a pre-thought through solution to that problem.
Absolutely. So for people that take the course the first time, the Micromanagement Detox course, I think it might seem like, especially if you're a person that maybe you're not necessarily a micromanager, right? Like you've just exhibited some behaviors, but you're not that bad. No one's given you the active feedback that like, hey, you're a really bad micromanager. You might take this course and think, wow, these are an extreme amount of steps to carry and do. But there's 2 things here. One, exactly to your point, it's about building the muscle and building the good practices, because we know no one's ever going to be living at the ideal best practices, right? Everyone's going to like fade a little bit. But if you're starting from something that's really good and you're fading a little bit, you'll be much better than if you weren't here at all and you're like starting from not a great, baseline, and you're fading from there, right? The second thing is that the course, when I built it, I had in mind someone who was already like me, who was deep in their micromanagement, who's had the self-awareness that I need to change, but maybe doesn't have a guidebook for making that change. So that's why, there's even a section on emergency situations. What happens if you're dealing with someone that is ready to quit because of you or because of the situation? And that is why I've pushed the course intentionally a little bit toward that extreme, with the intention of helping people who need it there, but also building positive practices for just managers in general.
Just to circle back on something you spoke about earlier, you spoke about management being a one-to-one relationship. I think one of the things that a lot of new leaders struggle with is they hear that, they implement that, and then they get this kind of emotional whiplash, this kind of altitude whiplash. If you're leading a team and you've got, say, a couple of juniors who need very, very specific support, and you've got a senior engineer who kind of just needs to be given the problem, and they go away and come up with a solution. Switching and changing between helping and supporting those two can be this kind of emotional whiplash of like, going from a place where you have to be very, very hands-on and supporting to somewhere where you don't need to be and shouldn't be. And you can find those behaviors kind of leaking between those two. What advice do you have for leaders who are dealing with that disparity of experience in the people they're working with?
Yeah, if you are in a large organization, that hopefully is something that the organization has thought about via its own internal approach to spans and layers, where your manager is not putting you in a situation where you have such a disparate leveling on your team, right? If you're in a startup, you can't avoid it. Well, you can try to avoid it. You can argue that it's more within your control to avoid it, but it's not always possible. One of the things I did for myself is just try to, as much as possible, to carve out specific days. So I would try to not go from a one-on-one with someone who's more junior and more needing support to someone who's more senior and more hands-off on the same moment, so I don't carry that emotional baggage back and forth. Even if I can't do that and things have to be the same day, I never do back-to-back one-on-ones. That's been one of the big things for me personally, because I realized that I need emotional breathing room for myself, because going into a one-on-one, you never know what's going to happen, right? Like you as one party, whether you're the manager or someone else, you have your own idea of what you're checking in on, what you're bringing in. But ultimately, you may not have the best sense of what someone else is bringing in. They might bring in something heavy that's unexpected, and you need a little bit of a buffer from that. Or at least I do.
Yeah, that's a technique I use a lot, and there's a next step on that technique, which is called calendar defragging, which I love that term. And anybody that's over the age of sort of 35-year-old probably knows what defragging is. For those of you who are watching who are not ancient, back in the days when we used to store our data on spinning disks of rust called hard drives, they were not optimal, because you would write data all over the place, and you would go through this process called defragging, which would effectively take all the little bits of the file that were spread all over the disk and put them sequentially on the disk. And the idea was that this was quicker to read from because you didn't need to jump all over the place. Calendar defragging is exactly the same technique applied to your calendar. It's to look at the tasks that you're doing and think about the emotional, the cognitive, the altitude shifts that these require, and to try and minimize those adjustments. So, going from like when my last employee job, I was working at a large social media company, and I was responsible for a third of their engineering team and the strategy of the whole part of their product, and I was even rebuilding the product development process from end to end. And that altitude, I would then have to go and be coaching a brand new leader who this was their first ever leadership job. Going from thinking about the whole product development process for a multi-hundred person software development company to coaching a one-on-one leader for the first time who'd never done leadership before, that was whiplash. And so, making sure that I wasn't doing those two things very close to each other was kind of key to me handling my own energy and focus. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, Google the term calendar defragging. Of course, because this is something I do, it's part of one of my training courses on Tech Leaders Launchpad. But there's plenty of resources out there. Ben, thank you for pointing out that I'm not the only old person in this call. It makes me feel a lot better. And Jason, somebody should build an app for this. One of the things that I do is I color code my calendar entries.
Yes.
Like that. Do you want to talk about doing that, James?
I mean, I think we do the same thing, right? I have color coded calendar for different types of things. This is harkening back to even outside of the emotional whiplash, there's just the cost of context switching, right? I think the latest research shows that context switching costs 15 to 20 minutes between activities. So I even try to lump similar activities together, especially if you're at a startup and you're like really bouncing all over the place. One of the biggest challenges in any job that I've ever done is that it's always been a very generalist type of role, where in one moment I'm in the code, and then in the other moment I'm with a customer service call. And to the extent that it's possible, trying to lump those together, it's hard. It really is challenging. But I try to spend a few minutes at the start of each day looking at my calendar for the next day and the day after and seeing where I have opportunities to kind of clump a little bit.
Yeah, and I think with all of these techniques, there's the ideal to strive towards that we never get to, but having these in mind is how you do it in the best way. So we're rapidly getting towards the top of the hour. This, as always, goes incredibly quickly. So if you've got a question you're holding back, please ask it soon, because we're going to be wrapping up in the next 10 minutes or so. So James, tell me about the how you kind of come back from a relationship where you've been an incredibly micromanaging manager. Say for example you've been working with somebody and you've gone through the training course on TLL and you've got, oh my god, I'm micromanaging, and you've had this epiphany of the behaviors you're doing. There's obviously the process of helping course correct yourself. But how do you start that conversation with somebody, and how do you kind of, repair the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it depends on the degree to how bad it was. But the starting point is always just being brutally honest and having a conversation with your direct report. If you can be honest and tell them, hey, I have looked at your feedback, if that's valid, right? But anyways, I think I have a bit of a problem micromanaging, and that's something that I want to work on. And, I want to acknowledge it and just have you hold me accountable to some of those things. Would that be okay? That will do so much for repairing that relationship. Because, micromanagement oftentimes comes from a place of my way is the right way. Because that's essentially, if you're a backseat driver, right? If you're an impatient chaser, if you're a Budinsky, if you're an eager beaver, you're basically saying, oh, I'm butting in because I feel like I have the answer. I'm really eager because I feel like I have the right approach. I'm chasing you because I feel like I could do it quicker. I am trying to backseat drive because I feel like my approach is better. So really the micromanager's point of reference for why they feel triggered when there's a quality or a quantity of work problem is really themselves. And so just admitting that you see that challenge and that you're wanting to make change will do a lot for the direct report. I would say the next thing is, and this is what's really hard, and this is something that I also read about in a blog that Charity Majors wrote, and I super resonated it. She talked about this when she was not getting along with her co-founder, and they were having some really difficult conversations, is to be brutally honest and direct about the emotional trigger itself. So say things like, hey, this is really hard for me to say, if you need to caveat that, but I feel wildly pissed off when you are doing so slowly, or whatever whatever that thing may be, right? Just don't hold those things back. A lot of times we feel like we need to hold those things back because saying it out loud is damaging. But the point of my course is that if you're in that emergency situation, that person's already on the verge of quitting anyway. You have very little to lose. But instead, by admitting it, you can be like, hey, I'm really pissed off. This is happening. Should I be pissed off? Like, is it that you're slow, or is it that you are doing a bunch of other things that I'm not even aware of? Because the other thing is that, like, we, in all of our relationships, we do a lot of labor, a lot of small things that nobody notices, right? And so maybe someone's not slow. Maybe someone is just really thorough about documentation. I can't get mad at that. Like, that's a really positive thing. So being very direct will really help open that relationship to both of you, to exploring, gosh, like, is this a valid concern that I have? Because micromanagers tend to have a lot of concerns, a lot of complaints. Are these things really valid, or is the person actually doing something else in a better way? I'll give another example. One of my direct reports, I had an era where I thought everyone was slow. Okay. So this is another person that I was like, gosh, this person's so slow. They finally told me, but they hadn't for quite a while, that they had a form of dyslexia, but only, I forgot what it's called. It's a form of dyslexia, but it applies to numbers. So it's not letters, but it's numbers. And I was like, oh, I wish you'd said that from the beginning, because that makes so much more sense now. And now, if I give you like a list of numbers or something very numeric, lots of IDs or math or whatever, I know that this might take you a little bit more time to process. And it was that openness that made me realize, oh, I can take a step back here. This person's not intentionally being slow. Yeah.
I'm
That's a
just
great talk.
I'm just posting in the chat. You mentioned charity majors. Charity and I actually discussed exactly that topic on this live stream about a year ago.
Yes.
It was a great chat. She dug into that whole co-founder relationship, and we said it earlier. Like, a lot of these things are applicable in personal relationships as much as work, and she goes into how the stuff that she learned working with the co-founder helped her in other areas of her life, and vice versa. I think it's these skills are just so incredibly important everywhere in our lives.
Yeah. I loved that talk. I use the analogy of being a manager is like parenting a lot of the time, not in a condescending way, right? Like, I'm not trying to say, like, your direct report is a child who doesn't know the difference between an apple and an orange. But like, when we parent, when some people parent, there's so much rigor in the level of preparation that they do, so many books that they read, but we often don't apply that same approach to managing people. But it can have the same impact, because humans are just fundamentally very emotional beings, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I specifically talk about that one of my direct reports had to call me out on was, hey, James, sometimes you make an offhanded comment, this notion of an offhanded comment, right? And I think a lot of times parents are very keenly aware of, like, oh, we don't want to say X in front of our children, whether it's a cuss word or whatever topic or whatever. But as managers, sometimes we forget that, oh, because of this power dynamic, if I just make an offhanded comment, which that instance of, like, are you still working on that, could be, an offhanded comment. An offhanded comment like that, even in the case that the person brought up to me, I was asking them to do lots of favors. It's like, hey, can you grab XYZ from me? I think in one case it was like, can you bring me back a lunch or whatever? And that, like, made that person feel like they were, a little bit of like an intern getting me food or whatever, even though I was like, well, we're just both really busy. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it that way, right? But it's just being aware of those remarks and the impact that can have, again, depending on your direct report and that relationship and how they might, their personality and how they might take it. That's something that I think parents do really well. I'm not a parent myself, but I often wonder if there is, like, some correlation between being a good parent and being a good manager.
I do a lot of public speaking at conferences, and there's a talk that's been rattling around my brain that I really want to put together. I became a father for the first time a couple of years ago, and watching my son grow and develop, and watching the way that he experiences and experiments with the world, and watching my kind of behaviors change when I'm with him, and the way that I'm changing as he's growing. There's so many analogies that I'm seeing towards the stuff that I do as a day-to-day job and the stuff that I have done in my career. Just the simple things like he's not afraid of experimentation. He will sit there, he will pick up the square block and he will put it in every single hole to find the one that it fits in. And he doesn't care if he does that 10 times and it only fits in the last one. He doesn't care. He doesn't think, oh, people think I'm an idiot for trying to put the square hole in a square block in the round hole. I'm just having fun experimenting, and I'm going to work this out. And I think we can learn a lot from that. There's for me, talks tend to start from an idea and a name, and if I can nail the idea and the name and it feels compelling, the talk just appears. So I've got the idea. I need to come up with a name. I'm thinking something like, what my 2-year-old taught me about engineering leadership.
Yes.
Something like that. It's got to be a little bit controversial. Or how my 2-year-old made me a better leader. Like it's something like that.
Yes.
Then I'm going to put it together and do it at some conferences. We're at the top of the hour, so we're gonna start wrapping up and finishing. James, this has been great as always with these. This hour just completely whizzes by, and I wonder where it's gone. Is there any resources you want to share with people? Any places you want to send them? Obviously, the Tech Leaders Launchpad training course that you built.
Yes.
But where did you learn this stuff? You've talked about Charity Majors. Her blog. Why don't you talk about her blog for a minute?
Her blog is really great. There's so much to learn from her blog. I was reading. She posted something recently about the founder mode debate that I really resonated with because, well, founder mode in many ways touches on micromanagement. Let's just put it that way. So her blog is a great resource. I really enjoy it. One of the things I will say, though, and this harkens back to one of the things that she said, I think it's a great closing point. One of the things that I believe makes me a better manager and a better leader is just more experiences. The more experiences I gather in life, the more open-minded it makes me, the more curious it makes me. One of the most interesting ways of getting experiences is bouncing back and forth between being a manager and being an employee. And I know Charity has a whole post on this about going back and forth between engineering management and being an engineer. Fortunately, in engineering, this is a little bit more acceptable, right? In other functions, it's a little bit harder for someone to be like, oh, I was a chief marketing officer, and now I'm going to be back to being a marketing lead. But to the extent that you can open yourself up to those other opportunities in life, maybe it's even volunteering at a neighborhood or a community organization where you're not the leader and just taking a backseat role. There's so much that you can learn about management just from being managed by other people. Of course, you have to also manage, right, to put those into practice and to evolve and adapt it to you. But I think that's a wonderful resource. And it's all about just, again, tapping into you as a person and your ability to learn and grow from the world around you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Thank you. Okay, so if you're watching me on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. If you're watching me on LinkedIn, please follow me on LinkedIn. Next, up in the live streams in about a month's time, we've got Tim Newbold. Tim is a OKR coach. I love Tim. Tim is one of my longest friends from when I moved to Melbourne. And what I love about Tim is that the way he approaches talking about OKRs is, you all know what OKRs are. Here's 10 minutes on OKRs. Here's 6 hours on how not to fuck them up, because that's the thing that most people do. And so, the actual basic principles behind OKRs, you can learn very, very quickly. As with a lot of these models, it's, the intricacies of how you actually go about implementing it. The devil's in the details of doing that. And that's what Tim and I are gonna talk a lot about. Next month is how you can actually make this way of doing your objectives kind of a key part of how you do things, and a kind of process in itself where you don't fall foul of a lot of the mistakes. If you like this, please follow me on LinkedIn or subscribe to my newsletter. I do these things regularly because I enjoy it. I love these conversations that I have with people like James. So once again, James, thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for sharing your insights on this. I've enjoyed it hugely. If you want to follow James on LinkedIn, I'll put his profile in there as well. It'll be on the LinkedIn live event. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, James, go on.
I was just say thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I love the opportunity, and feel free to send me a message. I'm very open to questions and to helping. I really enjoy that aspect. Yeah.
Great, awesome, and we've just had a thank you from Ben. Yeah, thank you for coming along, Ben. This engagement is why we do this. It's one thing to shout the stuff into the void. It's another thing to know that people are resonating with it and getting something from it. So thank you for letting us know you did. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. I will see you next time on Tech Leaders Launchpad livestream. See you guys later.